Three, two, one.
We'd like to welcome you to another edition of GrokTALK, brought to you by New Hampshire's leading conservative blog site, GrokTALK.com. We are your feared, extremist, right-wing, hard-charging, gun-toting, opinionated, outspoken, rabble-rousing, letter-writing, radio, microphone stomping conservatives and rational libertarians. So get ready for more news and opinion you could only get from GrokTALK.com.
GrokTALK.
You missed the stuff that happens on the break. They were having a nice discussion about HP and technology, and we're not going to go there right now, maybe at the end of the show. But this is GrokTALK. Welcome back, coming to you live and pre-recorded later in the week from the beautiful CNHT studios in Concord, New Hampshire. Always a pleasure to be here. A little cold this morning. It's warming up, though. It's been kind of nice the last week, so not as bad as it's been. And that's a good thing because it's been kind of lousy weather up here, but we're not here to talk about the weather. That's coming up in segment 4. In the meantime, what we'd like to do is bring on Greg Klein from Red, Maryland. So we needed a voice from the state who is on the ground and near the riots in Baltimore. And this is our guy. We've had him on the show before. Greg, good morning.
Good morning. How are you guys?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Good. Well,
watching in horror. So let's hear the reality from the ground, as it were.
There's a lot.
All right, where do you guys want to start?
Well, you know, that's a good question, and I've been thinking about it for 2 or 3 days now because there's so many things we could talk about. You know, the city systemics, the police force, the Dem walk on power, corruption, incompetence, what sparked it, Freddie Gray, the injuries, the outside provocateurs, the 180-degree change in evidence, the overcharging by the prosecutor. I honestly don't know where to start, so I'm kind of hoping you can help us out.
And David Clark's always sanguine opinions.
So, give us yours. I mean, you're there. You're in Maryland. You know,
right.
You know people in politics and in the city and the governor and everything. What would you be writing about with regard to this situation?
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things I'm writing about right now that we'll have up at Red, Maryland this afternoon is some thoughts on these indictments that came out. And you guys, even in that little intro, I think kind of touched on something that I think is on our side of things we need to be a little bit careful about. I think there's been this knee-jerk reaction by conservatives with these indictments coming out against the police that somehow this is entirely politically motivated, that these are baseless charges against good cops, and that everything's being overcharged. You got to be careful about that, guys. There's no question that there's political motivation here. There's no question that our Baltimore City State's Attorney, and I saw one national commentator refer to it as the Maryland State's Attorney. The prosecutor represents the city of Baltimore, and she was just recently elected. It's not the entire state. In fact, our Maryland Attorney General has refused to get involved in the case and do his own investigation. That's another subject. Some of the reporting that had been going on even this week that somehow Mr. Gray had inflicted these injuries on himself, that's kind of been debunked. In fact, the source of that story from a local D.C. television station was interviewed in Baltimore and disputed that account and he was the only guy who was in the paddy wagon with the guy. The other thing is there's been this kind of internet rumor, really has been completely debunked, that Mr. Gray was involved in some sort of previous injury suit where he had serious spinal cord injuries. That's been completely debunked. But it's still making the rounds and people are relying on it. Look, guys, this isn't like Ferguson or the Eric Garner case where you had somebody who was actively resisting arrest and the police had to take action that resulted in the guy's death, either by using force in self-defense or someone was injured as a result of actively resisting arrest. This was a guy who was in police custody. He was secured in a police vehicle and suffered injuries during that period of time. Now, what exactly happened is disputed, and there's not a whole lot that's known about it. But it's pretty clear that it's very possible that these police officers, and there is a history of this in Baltimore City, we shouldn't be blinded to this fact, of giving defendants rough rides and things like that. And the fact is, this guy was arrested. You can argue whether he was resisting police by running away when they, and certainly this guy has a criminal record. There's no question about that. But the state's attorney basically made the determination there wasn't probable cause even to arrest him in the first place. That's probably going to be one of the hottest factual disputes, but he wasn't actively engaged in a crime at the time he was arrested. So I'd be a little leery before we start talking about 180 degrees turns on the evidence and overcharging. There may be some overcharging, and the process will certainly play out. But we've got bad cops in Baltimore City and have for a long time, which brings me back to kind of the one of the most interesting things about this entire ordeal is that's extraordinary. And I think, this is something you guys have probably been talking about as well. This week we've had the mayor of Baltimore, and of course, Al Sharpton's come to town to make things a lot worse, trying to blame... you had this extraordinary statement from Al Sharpton defending the mayor of Baltimore City, saying that it's not her fault. These things have been going on for decades. And I'm thinking, well, that's probably true, but there hasn't been a Republican mayor in the city of Baltimore since 1968, and there hasn't been a Republican elected to a city office there as city council since 1939. And we've only had, 5 years that we've had a Republican governor in the state of Maryland during that time as well. So Al Sharpton has to be blaming the Maryland Democratic Party
and especially O'Malley, who's been both mayor and governor.
Well, and that's true. And the biggest victim in this has clearly been Martin O'Malley, because he cut short a money-making trip to Ireland to come back, and when he came back and gave speeches, he got tough questions, which he's not used to getting asked, which he wasn't asked when he was governor, frankly, and he got heckled in Baltimore City. Even David Simon, the producer of The Wire, who still says he would vote for him, by the way, so don't lose sight of that, came out and basically blamed all of this on Martin O'Malley and his mass arrest policies.
Well, those policies have largely worked. They worked in New York under Giuliani, and I think they helped Baltimore a little bit. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't treat the arrestees well. You still have to properly secure them and not beat them up. And who the heck knows what? One of the pieces of the story is, as part of the ride, he was not secured and may have been thrashing himself around, but. Well, yeah, that's only half the story. I know. I know that there was some. I'd be careful about equating what Martin O'Malley did exactly. I know there's some similarities, and they brought some Ed Norris from New York City. We're not talking about broken glass policing here, broken window policing, which I agree with you is very effective. This was as much a case of just Martin O'Malley had a public policy to just arrest people. And if he just arrested people and took them off the streets, then that was going to reduce things. Most of them were never charged with anything. That's a little different than, focusing on petty crimes and quality of life crimes, which was done in New York City. That makes a whole lot of sense. And of course, the current mayor has exactly the opposite policy, which is let's arrest less people, even if they committed crimes, in the interest of making the statistics look better.
Well, that's part of it, and before all of this happened, Baltimore was back on track this year for 300 murders. So that certainly was the case, and certainly it was very, very lax policing on Saturday and on Monday that led to the widespread destruction and things getting out of control because the police, essentially, whatever the mayor says she said or claims she meant or whatever. The fact is that the police here were very clearly given rules of engagement to allow these rioters to destroy property, and they took full advantage of it and went beyond that.
Yeah, and of course she said it's only property.
And the thing is, yeah, it's only property, but it's not her property. These are residents that actually have invested in her city, and it's not her money either. The insurance companies will pay for it. The evil insurance companies. Yeah, right.
Well, that's of course none of that's true. And when you hear some of the stories, like there was, you've probably seen some of the stories about the shoe warehouse that the owner watched for 4 hours on his surveillance cameras this place getting looted, and the police did nothing, not one thing to interdict for 4 hours while this guy's watching his family's business being looted. You know, one of the things that isn't getting widely reported but is reported here is that during the riots, you know, there was a lot of involvement from local drug gangs who are now, you know, at the table trying to make peace, which is just extraordinary. But there are reports that there were gang leaders or gang members who were protecting African-American-owned businesses and directing looters to Asian-owned businesses. And there's no question that Asian-owned businesses were some of the hardest hit and most often looted on Monday.
Yeah, Greg?
And a lot of those folks who've been interviewed and talking to the press, you know, they don't have insurance that's going to replace a lot of this stuff.
Greg, this is
so,
Skip.
You know, that's one ugly aspect of this that isn't getting reported either, and kind of undermines, you know, what the mayor is saying is it's just property, because it was a little darker than that.
Yeah, Greg, this is Skip. You know, doesn't this kind of give lie once again to what Elizabeth Warren, the uber progressive senator from Massachusetts, who in her Warrenism rant said, "You didn't build that. We all helped to build that." And she said, you know, government is the entity that makes it possible for you not to have to hire people to protect your property, talking about business owners. And, you know, we saw that in Ferguson, now we've seen it here. So, well, gosh, if government can't protect me and my property, what good is it?
Well, that's why you have to protect your own. And, of course,
Baltimore
is
one. And, of course, in the city of Baltimore, they have very strict gun rules, and we do here in Maryland as well. So that was, even though you do have some business owners that you know, were able to do that and take advantage of what limited Second Amendment rights they have. But you know what? There's a dirty little secret. I had people asking me this week. I'm an attorney here in Maryland as well. You know, if the mayor is going to allow this stuff to happen, you know, can these business owners seek redress from the government, from the city?
Ooh.
And the answer is there have been courts that have ruled. This is kind of a dirty little secret. There are courts that have ruled that the government doesn't have an obligation to protect individuals, let alone property.
We've talked about that in New Hampshire a number of times.
The Supreme Court decision where police didn't have to protect the individuals. But, you know, in such an event as what's been happening in Baltimore, that's not just a single individual. That's a whole mess of people. You know, obviously the CVS store on fire caught national attention. And there's the police just standing there. Wouldn't that be evidence to be able to say, you didn't do your job?
Well, but the point is, as the courts have said, they don't have an obligation to stop it.
I would
not one that's actionable anyway. I mean, I think they have a moral and, you know, constitutional obligation, but it's not like the CVS Corporation, which, by the way, you saw one on TV burn. There were actually a couple other drugstores in the city that burned at the same time, that weren't, you know, live on air while we were watching it. But they're not going to be able to get recovery from the city. Now, that doesn't mean that at the end of the day that, you know, government, and probably the state government's not going to step in and try to fix some of this mess. It's one of the things we've been talking about. Even once this unrest dies down and things return to normal, the cost of this is going to be enormous, and it's going to drive politics here in Maryland for some time.
Greg, we're going to take 60 seconds. Stay in line. We'll be right back as soon as I push the right button.
This is the Coalition of New Hampshire Taxpayers. We're located at 8 North Main in Concord, New Hampshire. This is the repository for all things conservative and municipal. So if you have a problem in your town, your school, your budget committee, the right to know law, and now the top of our list is voter fraud. You have a tip for us, some information for us, you want to join or help us out, cnht.org.
Hi, this is Rich Gerard, host of Gerard at Large in the Morning. the Manchester area's only locally owned, locally operated, focused, and interested, riveting radio show, heard live every Monday through Friday from 6 to 9 on 90.7 FM WLMW, New Hampshire Family Radio, and available 24/7 live or archived at GerardAtLarge.com. Be sure to tune in.
This is Grok Talk. We're talking to Greg Klein from Red, Maryland about the riots in Baltimore, getting good, fresh information from the ground to contradict all the other crazy stuff we've been hearing about. So we've obviously got city politics. We've got, police abuse, possibly. We've got, the media nonsense that always goes on that clouds the reality. At the end of the day, a riot started, and so we should probably try to clear up some other stuff. There's been reports of people from outside coming in to irritate tensions and to make things worse. Of course, Al Sharpton showed up, as you said, which is never a good thing. No. What's the reality there?
Well, the reality is there were a lot of reports, and initially on Saturday, the reporting locally, because, of course, that on Saturday night, the national media was more worried about the correspondence dinner than they were about the riots going on 40 miles up the road. But the reporting was there were a lot of outside agitators. The reality is, when you look at the police arrest records, the vast majority of the people involved in these were Baltimoreans. There may be people outside agitating, but it's not a big factor. This is homegrown. And I think to some extent that's why you've seen it die down so quickly once the police, and really once the governor of our state stepped in and got the thing under control, that we haven't seen the widespread unrest that we saw before. Because this was homegrown, and you had an inadequate police response, a really failed police response. I mean, I'm sure you guys have seen the video. I mean, Monday afternoon, where you were seeing police officers carried away injured and being pelted with rocks. I mean, it's just extraordinary that the city of Baltimore simply lost control of a big chunk of that city, and as you guys pointed out, watched it burn literally until finally. And this is an important point that I do want to get to, if you guys will let me. Sure. We have a Republican governor here who just got elected in November, and he's done such a fantastic job getting this thing under control, and he's kind of getting some national profile for it. But the Democrats here, and I know Al Sharpton went after him particularly. This Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake, who we've been a critic of for a long time at Red, Maryland, is just not used to getting negative press, and she's been really trying to get out from under all the criticism from the way the city handled this. In Maryland, and I don't know if New Hampshire is the same way or not, in order for the governor to bring in the National Guard, one of two things has to happen. Either there has to be a request from a locality, a local jurisdiction, for an emergency declaration, which is what happened here, or the governor would have to unilaterally declare martial law, which hasn't happened here in a long time. The governor was anticipating that emergency declaration was going to be brought by the mayor, but she kept putting it off. The governor, as the governor mentioned on Monday night, the usual response time for the National Guard to get activated is 8 hours. He was planning ahead, and that reaction time was much, much shorter. In fact, he was ready to go once he got asked to come in. And when the mayor finally called and asked for help, he signed an executive order within 30 seconds of that phone call, and the trucks were on the road immediately. There have been some on our side who've been kind of critical of why he didn't unilaterally just go in himself. I think it's pretty obvious from the optics that you've already seen that would have been a mistake.
Harry
but more
Truman.
Importantly, and this is important to remember for people,
when the mayor of Baltimore asked for an emergency declaration, she did two things that are critical to remember. And I think they explain why she delayed. Number one, incumbent in that request was the mayor of Baltimore had to acknowledge that the mayor and the city of Baltimore, who prior to Monday had state police and outside jurisdictions supporting them, but they still had to admit that their resources were inadequate to deal with the emergency, that they in the city could not handle the emergency. Yeah. So by requesting state aid, they admitted that, number one. And number two, they had to turn over control to the state of Maryland. And in this case, it would have been the state police who would have come in and taken over there, along with the support of other jurisdictions. Yeah. So, while the mayor is trying to, and Commissioner Batts and the city have continued to have press conferences and act like they're running the show, the reality is they admitted failure on Monday, called for state aid, and the state stepped in. And since that time, you haven't seen the unrest that you saw. You haven't seen any rioting. You haven't seen that kind of unrest because the state has been running the show. And the governor, who's been trying very hard not to make this a political issue or not to try to point fingers, even though he's been getting a lot of criticism from those in the city who are very defensive right now, including Al Sharpton coming into their defense, has done a really masterful job not only managing the situation and dealing with the emergency, but going out to the city and meeting with people and working in the community to try to build some, long-term improvements to what's going on here. And he's not been making it a political issue the way that the Democrats have. And sometimes, I don't think he gets the credit he deserves. But I think it's important for people, especially outside of Maryland, to understand that, we have a Republican grown-up who's governor of the state. And the difference between Democrats and Republicans in Maryland was on clear display between Monday and the rest of the week.
Greg, quick question for just to answer your question. Our governor, while being the weakest in the nation, can call out the National Guard at his or her whim to deal with anything. We're a much smaller state. Towns and cities are only political subdivisions of the state, so the state has that ability to do what they want when they want, so that's not a problem. But as you're talking about Governor Hogan there, has he gotten pretty good kudos for the way that he's handled it? I know he's tried to be more in the background from looking from up here down to there. Are people seeing that dichotomy of quiet but effective versus loud and ineffective at all?
Because he not only was he prepared, but he also basically moved a mobile headquarters into town and kept that low-key as well.
Yeah, well, he's had his press conferences. I think the media has tended... I don't think he's gotten the credit he deserves, which is one of the reasons I wanted to point it out. I think part of that is, as he said publicly, I'm not here to point fingers or, cast blame. I'm here to solve the problem. But part of it is, too, and having said that, he pointed out on his press conference on Monday night that exactly what I just told you. He was ready to go. He signed the executive order 30 seconds when he was asked. And he moved very, very quickly and very effectively. And the head of our National Guard here, Major General Singh, has been incredibly impressive in the way that she's handled things and in the media. I don't think he has gotten, because the media has continued to, and some of this is scripted by the mayor of Baltimore, who's had multiple press conferences with local leaders and brought in people to kind of come to her defense, in the way she handled this, because she, it's always a political issue. I'd frankly like to see the governor be a little more assertive in pointing out how he was responsible for bringing this. In the fullness of time, I think we'll see some of that play out, but I don't think he's gotten enough credit.
Okay, let me look at my list real quick.
Harry Truman had a sign on his desk that said, "The buck stops here." He was the president, and there were no excuses for anything that happened below him.
No, and these days we see them all trying to weasel out of any responsibility for their own actions, never mind anybody else's.
That started with Clinton.
Yeah.
All right, Greg. Brian Griffiths wrote something at Red Maryland. And,
well, anything that's happened below waist level wasn't his problem.
He, thanks for the aside. He was pointing out some issues with the way the city was funding projects and loans and investment in the city, and how I'm kind of wandering off the reservation here. How they weren't really directing resources to the places that needed it. Do you think this impacted the response? I mean, did it irritate them? Did it really fire up a riot? I mean, was that really necessary?
No. What really allowed things to get out of control was just the poor police response to what was anticipated and what was known. And then when they were engaged, they backed off and gave license essentially to the rioters to get out of control. What Brian's talking about and addressing is the arguments that are being made that this is coming out of some, social justice concern, and, communities that are perpetually disadvantaged economically. And what Brian's pointing out there is, just like the way the police handled the situation over the weekend, the city has been horribly mismanaged when it comes to the way that it handles economic development and economic resources. Look, you have to understand that the politics of Baltimore City, as I mentioned earlier on, it's not remotely competitive. I mean, this is an oligarchy that runs Baltimore City. It's a one-party, and it's not even competitive within the Democratic Party. It's an oligarchy that's funded by development donations and the ministers who have power within the city. And the fact is, the way that economic development is oriented is not only inefficient because it's centrally planned, it's inefficient because it isn't oriented towards economic development results. It's oriented politically. So the development that gets done is not primarily concerned with what would be in the best interest of developing Baltimore. It's who are we giving favors to because they're helping fund our campaigns. And this is compounded by one of the criticisms that Brian wrote in the Baltimore Sun a year ago, which got an immediate reaction from Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake, that the mayors of Baltimore for some time have been more concerned about politics outside of the city than they have been fixing the problems in the city themselves.
All right, Brian,
Mayor Rawlings Blake is, if you don't know, he is secretary of the National Democratic Party.
Oh, great.
She is routinely referred to as a rising star in Democratic politics.
We're going to have to catch up because we're out of time, sir.
Okay.
But we will catch up offline and try to get some of that up on Granite Grok so that our readers and listeners will learn more about it. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
All right, we'll see you. Bye-bye. We will be right back.
New Hampshire is famous for scenic drives, but they're tough to enjoy when you're on your way to the doctor. Because Obamacare limits your choices, some will have to drive more than an hour to see a doctor. What's health insurance worth if care isn't there when you need it? Jean Shaheen voted for Obamacare, putting your doctors and hospitals further out of reach. Tell Senator Shaheen Obamacare is not working for New Hampshire.
Jean Shaheen and her allies are making false claims about her record on veterans. The truth? Shaheen refused to meet with veterans pushing for reform. She wasn't on the committee that wrote the reform legislation and refused to co-sponsor important VA reforms in the VA Management Accountability Act until after the VA scandal broke. When our veterans needed her, Jean Shaheen was AWOL. Tell Jean Shaheen to stop distorting the truth and fix the VA.
Hi, this is Rich Gerard, host of Gerard at Large in the Morning, the Manchester area's only locally owned, locally operated, focused, and interested, riveting radio show, heard live every Monday through Friday from 6 to 9 on 90.7 FM WLMW, New Hampshire Family Radio, and available 24/7 live or archived at GerardAtLarge.com. Be sure to tune in.
This is the Coalition of New Hampshire Taxpayers. We're located at 8 North Main in Concord, New Hampshire. This is the repository for all things conservative and municipal. So if you have a problem in your town, your school, your budget committee, the right to know law, and now at the top of our list is voter fraud. You have a tip for us, some information for us, you want to join or help us out, cnht.org.
Grok TV.